We're going to be in Exodus, starting in Exodus 13 this morning. Exodus 13. We're continuing our series on looking at the book of Exodus and how God formed the Israelites into a people after his own heart and how he wants to form us, what we can learn from their story. And last week we made it through. We made it through all of the plagues. We made it through all of the trials. And now there's freedom. We're going to talk about deliverance today and what happens after. As we begin our time together, I wanted to read a little excerpt from one of my all-time favorite stories. And I think it's going to help kind of frame where we're going today. The story is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. It takes place a couple decades after the French Revolution, and it's a time of rampant urban poverty. The criminal justice system is very severe in those days, and we read about the story of the main character, Jean Valjean. And so stick with me as I read a little bit this morning. After spending 19 years in a French prison for stealing a loaf of bread and every memory of his former life gone, Jean Valjean spends the first night of his release in the charitable home of Bishop Myriel, who feeds him and gives him a bed. And having seen the fine silver they used for dinner, Valjean decides he will steal away in the middle of the night with the plunder, but is arrested shortly thereafter. When brought back to the bishop, Myriel surprises all with his words. "Ah, here you are," he exclaimed, looking at Jean Valjean. "I am glad to see you." "Well, but how is this? I gave you the candlesticks too, which are of silver like the rest, and for which you can certainly get 200 francs. Why did you not carry them away with your forks and spoons?" Jean Valjean opened his eyes wide and stared at the venerable bishop with an expression which no human tongue can render any account of. "Monseigneur," said the brigadier of gendarmes, "so what this man said is true then? We came across him. He was walking like a man who is running away. We stopped him to look into the matter, and he had this silver." "And he told you," interposed the bishop with a smile, "that it had been given to him by a kind old fellow of a priest with whom he had passed the night? I see how the matter stands. And you have brought him back here. It is a mistake." "In that case," replied the brigadier, "we can let him go?" "Certainly," replied the bishop. The gendarme released Jean Valjean, who recoiled. "Is it true that I am to be released?" he said in an almost inarticulate voice, and as though he were talking in his sleep. "Yes, thou art released. Dost thou not understand?" said one of the gendarmes. "My friend," resumed the bishop, "before you go, here are your candlesticks. Take them." Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb. He took the 2 candlesticks mechanically and with a bewildered air. "Now," said the bishop, "go in peace. By the way, when you return, my friend, it is not necessary to pass through the garden. You can always enter and depart through the street door. It is never fastened with anything but a latch, either by day or by night." The bishop drew near to him and said in a low voice, "Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I buy from you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God." If you've never read that story or seen the movie before, you know what a shocking thing just took place. That the bishop would play along with Jean Valjean's story and allow him to go free rather than probably being imprisoned for the rest of his life. The reason I read that story, we're talking about deliverance today. God has just freed Israel from generations of slavery. And so the question I want to begin with today is, how would you respond if someone saved your life? How would you respond if someone saved your life? What's the proper response to deliverance? So keep that in mind as we read today. Let's start in Exodus 13, verse 11. We're going to skip around just a little bit today so we don't read like three chapters of stuff today. Starting in verse 11. After the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and gives it to you, as he promised on oath to you and your ancestors, you are to give over to the Lord the first offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. In days to come, when your son asks you, "What does this mean?" say to him, "With a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed the firstborn of both people and animals in Egypt. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb, and redeem each of my firstborn sons. And it will be like a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead that the Lord brought us out of Egypt with his mighty hand." We're going to pick up the rest of the story in a little bit, but let's stay there for a minute. The Israelites have finally left Egypt. And the first thing that they do in conversation with God asks them, in fact, he tells them, consecrate your firstborn to me. Dedicate them to me. They now belong to God. Think of the story of Samuel. Remember Samuel from 1 Samuel? His mother Hannah is barren. She goes to the sanctuary and she pleads with God for a child. In fact, she says to the Lord, "If you will just give me a son, I will devote him to you." What is she saying? We find out later in the story, God gives her a son, and what does she do? After he's weaned, she takes him back to Eli, the high priest, and she leaves him there. That's what she meant by, "I will devote my firstborn to you." I'm going to literally give him over to you. He belongs to you now, Lord. He's yours. That's what God's asking them, the Israelites, to do, to devote, to consecrate their firstborn to the Lord. These belong to God. But what's this all about? As I was doing my study this week, the application Bible that I was reading from actually gives us 3 reasons for why God asked them to do this. First of all, so God asked them to consecrate them, but then what did he ask them to do after that? He asked them to redeem them, to buy them back, in essence, right? To replace them, to substitute them with a lamb, okay? And so, first of all, I know your mind's jumping, but first of all, what does this remind you of? God has just taken the lives of the firstborn in Egypt. And so this act of consecration is to be a reminder to the Israelites of God sparing them, sparing their firstborn. And so this would be a continual reminder to them of what God had done, delivering them from Egypt through the plagues, and especially the final plague of killing the firstborn in Egypt. The second thing that we learn from this particular passage is that we're learning about God's character. Because we're learning that God does not want them to sacrifice their children to him, like a lot of the pagan gods would have required, right? The pagan religions would have required. God's saying, they are now mine, and by the way, you're going to buy them back from me. And so we see that God has a high regard for human life. God doesn't want them to sacrifice their children to him. He wants them to have the sense that this is due to him, this is owed to God, but now in his graciousness, in his goodness, in his high regard for human life, he's going to tell them to redeem them, to buy them back. Notice he said, if you don't want to redeem the donkey, for example, you can break its neck, you can end its life. But then he says, explicitly redeem all of your firstborn sons. High regard for human life. The third thing that it shows us, obviously, is a foreshadowing to Jesus, the Christ. Right? Jesus comes as the Lamb, as the substitution for us. Of course, I can't help but read this passage and think about what God's doing in it without thinking about Romans 12:1. Which says to us, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. As you put that passage side by side with the one that we just read from Exodus, it kind of gives new light to what we're reading there in Romans. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. But God said to redeem the sons back. In other words, God is saying, you're going to substitute the lamb. The lamb is going to take the place of the firstborn. The firstborn is coming back to you. So doesn't that mean that the firstborn son doesn't belong to God anymore? Therefore, he's not a living sacrifice? No, the point is that because the sons were spared in God's graciousness, he didn't have to offer that. We now live lives of gratitude unto God because he's given us life back. Does that make sense? We are a living sacrifice unto God, not out of obligation, but out of what? Gratitude. Okay. Let's keep going. 13 verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Picking up in 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal-Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, but I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. Jump down to verse 10 with me, please. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Crazy. That's just crazy. I'm going to highlight some things out of order. I love that they know their own story well enough that they brought up the bones of Joseph. What a kind of a strange thing to do. If you don't remember the story of Joseph, Joseph is one of the sons of Jacob, one of the 12 sons that would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Remember, he's sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers. Don't worry, I'm not going to hash out the whole story. God does some miraculous things in his life so that he is raised up to second in command in all of Egypt to help spare not just Egypt and the Israelites, but the surrounding region from a severe famine that would come on the land. And God does some just incredible things in and through Joseph's life. And then it's generations later where we pick up with the story in Exodus. If you remember all the way back to chapter 1 of Exodus, it said that the Pharaoh who rose to power knew nothing of Joseph. And he saw just how big the Israelite community was getting, and so that's why they enslaved them, because they were starting to get worried that the Israelite people would overwhelm them. Okay? But Joseph, before he died, Genesis 50, you can go read this, he says to take up his bones with them when they leave. God will deliver them, and he wants them to take his bones with them. Why? He wants to be buried in the place where his fathers are buried. Okay? Back in Genesis 47, we saw Jacob did this very thing. He made sure that his sons would bury him in Canaan, what would become the promised land. And so Joseph's just following suit. He wants his bones to be taken up to go to the land of Canaan, which I love because it's a reminder of Joseph's faith and a vision of the future that God intends for these people. Right? God's got a vision. He's taking them to a place, not just a place, but to a new life, a new way of life. And so taking up Joseph's bones is kind of a bid, if you will, for the community of Israel. Like, this is where we're going. We're going with Joseph to this land of promise, this land of a better future that awaits us. And can you imagine what it would be like to travel along with this pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, the continual presence of God day after day, month after month, year after year with the Israelite people? Just that tangible sense of God among them every day. How incredible would that be? It's interesting that the passage then tells us that they go out of Egypt ready for battle, which I just think is silly. Okay, these are enslaved people. They have no military training. They probably have zero weapons, real weapons. They don't know what they're doing. What does it mean that they went up ready for battle? It certainly doesn't mean that they went out armed for battle. Probably what the author is intending is that they were prepared in the sense that they were anticipating battle, challenge coming their way. I can only imagine that's what the author really means, because they're certainly not ready for battle. God knows this because he won't even take them through Philistine country, right? God knows if they head that way, they're just going to turn right around. So if you know your geography a little bit, Egypt obviously is the northern part of Africa. It's right on the southern edge of the Mediterranean. And so there was a main road that led up by the Mediterranean and up, I'm doing it backwards for you, that would take them east along the Mediterranean and up the coastline. That would have led them through Philistine territory. That would have been the easiest and the fastest road to take. But God says, we can't go the fastest route. We can't go the easiest route because that's going to present other challenges that are going to be too difficult for my people. They're not ready for this yet. I need to take them the long way around because they have stuff to learn along the way. Anybody relate to that? Sometimes God has to take us the long way around because we're not ready for what the fast route would take. So they're not ready for the Philistines, even though they're armed for battle. But they're not ready for the Egyptians to come after them either, right? The Egyptians, they start to see that the Israelites are moving in kind of this awkward way, this confusing way around the desert, even though God's doing it on purpose. And in their minds, this means they don't know what they're doing. They don't know they don't even know where they're going. And how silly of us to let them go. So we're going to go after them and get our slave labor back. And so they go after them. And when the Israelites see them coming, they start freaking out. And they start crying out. And so they're not ready to fight the Egyptians. In fact, they say it would be better to die. We should have just stayed in Egypt. Don't you remember us saying we should have just stayed there? Everything was fine there. They weren't saying that. What in the world? But they're so upset. They're so filled with the anticipation of suffering and perhaps death that they don't even really know what to do. They're crying out, but they're crying out with resignation, right? They're crying out with resignation, not expectation for God to deliver them. They're just concerned and don't know what to do other than bemoan their situation. Let's continue the story now. Chapter 14, picking up in verse 13. I'm just trying to break up the passage. I know it's a long passage, but we're breaking it up today to kind of help us stick with it. Chapter 14, verse 13. And then we'll read a couple different sections here. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." All right, we're going to skip down to verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. You need only stand still. Is that what God had them do? In fact, the very next verse, God says, "Why are you crying out? Get moving." You see, I think Moses actually misunderstood a little bit of what God was saying there. God says he's going to deliver them, that they are not going to have to fight, but he doesn't tell them to actually stand still. He says, get moving. Stretch out your hand that the sea might divide so that you can go through it. And so God is asking, he says, I'm going to do the heavy lifting of delivering you from the Egyptians, but that doesn't mean I'm asking you to do nothing. Get moving. Take steps of faith in the direction that I'm leading you. We participate, but God does the heavy lifting. You know what that's called? It's called synergism. There are camps of the Christian community that think that we are in a monogistic sanctification process, that God does 100% of the work. What we believe is that actually it's synergistic. We're partnering with God in what he's trying to do in us and through us. Okay? God does the heavy lifting, but we participate. God is saying, move, take steps of faith. And as they respond, as they partner with God, as God delivers them, and the Egyptians are caught up in the sea and not one survives, it says that they were filled with fear and trust. Now, we don't typically put those two things together, do we? Think about that for a minute. When you fear something, do you typically trust it at the same time? Kind of interesting. So we need to talk about what this kind of fear is, okay? The kind of fear that the author is describing here is a kind of reverence. It's a respect. Think of, it's a healthy fear, like when you fear a fire, right? It's not like we totally avoid using fire, but we're careful with it. We're cautious. We use it in a specific way, and we kind of set up parameters so that it's used properly, it's used well, so that we can do it safely, right? And then we pass these practices on to our kids so they do it safely so that they don't get burned. That's a healthy kind of fear, right? That's what we're describing here. We need to have a healthy fear about God, who he is, what he's capable of. We need to have a reverence for who he is. But we also can trust him. He is trustworthy. Reminds me a little bit of Chronicles of Narnia when the kids ask about Aslan, is he safe? What do they say? He's not safe, but he's good. Right? There's a little bit of need for caution, to be careful, to be reverent. But he's trustworthy. He's good. He keeps his promises. He's faithful. He has high regard for human life. Fear and trust. Got to hold them in tension together. So, how did the Israelites respond to God's deliverance? This goes back to our question at the beginning. What's the proper response when somebody saves your life? God didn't just save a life here, did he? But he saved an entire nation of people. What's the proper response to such deliverance? We're not going to read it today, but we see in chapter 15 the proper response. We hinted at it when we quoted from Romans 12:1. The proper response is worship. The proper response is worship when it comes to God. And so, I want to give you a formula today. I am not a math guy, but I'm going to give you a formula today because I think it's helpful. And it's a formula for worship. And it's this: the severity of our captivity plus the profundity of our deliverance equals our capacity for worship. Okay? The severity of our captivity, what do I mean? I mean, how bad is it? Where are you coming from? How entrenched are you? How inescapable is that situation? How bad is it? the severity of our captivity. The Israelites were totally trapped in slavery. There was no way they were getting themselves out of that predicament, right? That's pretty severe captivity. Plus the profundity of our deliverance. What lengths did God go to deliver them, to save them from their situation? Incredible lengths. Plague after plague after plague after plague after plague after plague. Miracle after miracle, right? That God's bringing to move them out of slavery. The profundity of the deliverance. What lengths did the Savior go to? Okay? The severity of our captivity plus the profundity of our deliverance equals our capacity for worship. If you know how bad it was and what incredible lengths it took to get you out of it, the amount of worship that flows out of you, that's huge, right? If I'm just saved from something really tiny over here and they didn't really go to a whole lot of effort, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. But if I am utterly stuck in the worst possible situation and my God goes to incredible lengths to remove me from that situation, how should that move me? The amount of worship that flows out of us should just be inexpressible. We should have such awe. I mean, I think of one of the stories that comes to mind is 2 Samuel 6, when David brings the ark to Jerusalem. Remember how they were so afraid of moving the ark from where it was because of how holy it was and some of the predicaments that they got into along the way. People even died trying to move this thing. And David very carefully brings the ark to Jerusalem. And as it's coming into the city streets, what does he start doing? He starts dancing. And apparently it's in such a way that Michal, his wife, who's looking out from the palace, she sees him and she's like, oh man. She's like so embarrassed for him and for herself because of how undignified he gets. That's the kind of worship that we're talking about. What lengths? How do we worship our God? What is he worthy of? Worship's not about how do I feel like expressing myself to God today. That's not worship. Worship is, what does God do? What has he saved me from? What is he worthy of? And I love how Moses responds. He starts singing this song that you read in Exodus chapter 15. Guys, remember where he came from. His excuses to the Lord about not wanting to deliver the people in God's name from Egypt. Remember what he said? I'm a man of faltering lips. And here he is writing and singing songs to the Lord. Probably wasn't very nice to hear, honestly. But he is so unselfconscious in his worship of the Lord. Not because this is primarily how he feels, although I'm sure he feels incredible gratitude. But it's about what the Lord is worth, what he is due, what he has done. The severity of our captivity plus the profundity of our deliverance equals our capacity for worship. So, what does all this have to do with our formation? How's God forming them? How does he want to form us? First of all, I want to point out, formation. One of the ways that God forms us is when we take steps of faith. We need to be taking steps of faith in our lives. How is God calling you to move in your life today? He's almost never asking you to just simply stand still. Even when we're in a period of waiting, there are things that we can do to live faithfully unto the Lord. How is he asking you to take steps of faith? That's part of why we end our sermon every week with a reflection and a step. So to give you a sense of what can I do with what we learned today? How can I take action upon it? Friends, when we take steps of faith, not having certainty about what God wants to do, but having a sense maybe God is in this, guess what? God responds to that. When we do things that are out of our comfort zone because we're trying to be faithful to Him, He honors that. I'm sure we could go around this room telling stories about how we weren't exactly sure what God wanted to do, but we had a sense maybe I should just kind of move in this direction or say this word to somebody or follow God in this kind of way, and to see how God honored that. Even if it wasn't quite the right thing and He kind of redirected, He brought honor. He was honored in it, and He honored the effort that we put in. Okay? Faith is opposed to earning, but it's not opposed to effort. Right? The second one is this idea of worship. Okay? Think about Moses' transformation in this story. Okay? Moses is being utterly transformed from a man afraid to speak, who will make up song lyrics and lead a nation in singing to the Lord. That's transformation, friends. That's like, I used to be that way, now I'm this way. Deliverance is what primarily moves us to worship. Do you have a good sense of the deliverance that God's brought to your life? You know, that's why we take time most weeks up here to the worship team usually leads us in a prayer of confession, right? Or acknowledgement of sin. Oftentimes the lyrics that we sing, or there's an acknowledgement of sin, of our own depravity, of our own, as we'll sing in a minute, wretchedness. Do you have a good sense of your own depravity? A good sense of what God has delivered you from? The severity of that situation? And the profundity of how He has delivered you? What's your capacity for worship? Again, worship is about attributing worth to God, not primarily expressing how we feel. Okay? Worshiping God is supposed to move us out of our comfort and into unselfconscious attention on the greatness of God. Okay? How do you get to a place of unselfconscious attention on the greatness of God? You have to kind of move through it. It's not something that you can avoid or go around. If you're one of those folks in the room who maybe you don't like to raise your hands in worship and do all that stuff, and you're not kind of sure how other people can get away with it, or it kind of looks funny to you, the only way to kind of give your whole body to the Lord in worship, and I'm not only talking about the way that we sing or do our corporate worship together, but I'm using it as an example. You kind of have to move through that. In fact, you know, if you're really comfortable raising your hand in worship, that's wonderful, and that is an expression of worship to the Lord. And those physical gestures that we use are a symbol, a physical, tangible gesture to the Lord, saying, I agree with what these words are saying, or God, I surrender this to you in this area of my life. That's what we're doing when we respond physically in worship. But if that's not you, that's okay. And in fact, I would say, if you want to use your whole body in worship, but that feels like such a big leap for you, leaning into that, and having a little bit of self-consciousness about it is normal, but just start right here, you know. You can just lift your hands right here. Nobody has to notice what's going on. But just start to offer your whole self to the Lord. Again, I'm not just talking about in our corporate worship. What I'm saying is there any part of you that you withhold from worshiping God? Because guess what? He's worthy of all of it, all of you. And so where are you holding back from God? So both in this area of taking steps of faith and in the area of worship, these two different areas we're talking about in terms of formation today, both require you to get out of your comfort zone. And both of them require you to put God ahead of yourself. Okay? Here's the reflection for today. In response to God's deliverance of your life from sin? Have you consecrated your life to God? Are there any facets of life that you are withholding from Him? Is your life an expression of worship to God? Is your life an expression of worship to God? And if you, as you're reflecting upon that, and you can identify there's any area of your life where you say, that's certainly not worship, bring that before the Lord. Say, God, have your way with this. I want to worship you with my whole life because you are worthy. How would you like me to do this differently so that it might honor you? Okay, here's the step. Are there any places in your life where God is telling you to stop standing still and to start moving? Prayerfully consider what step to make and then make it. Let's pray about that. God, you certainly do the heavy lifting when it comes to our deliverance. This gift of grace is 100% of you. And yet you also call us to respond, to receive that grace. You ask us to take steps of faith so that our faith might grow, so that we might look more like Christ. God, we're only going to look more like Christ if we do things that are out of our comfort zone, that don't feel like us. And that's, Lord, because you're asking us to be transformed in the image of Christ. So it can't always look like who we think we are today. Lord, would you give us the courage? Would you give us the power by your Spirit? Would you give us the vision for the life that you're calling us to? If there's something new that you're calling us into today, would you give us really a lot of clarity about that? But God, where there's a lack of clarity, would you give us more faith to step into that, knowing that you'll redirect if we're off track? Help us to trust in that because you are trustworthy and you are worthy of praise. In Jesus' name, amen.